Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. This morning, our amazing volunteer, Terri Meeks, will talk about a grave matter, tombstone art and its meaning. But before I turn it over to Terri, some housekeeping notes. If you have any questions or comments you would like to share during the program, please type them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we will make sure all of your comments and questions get addressed at the end of the presentation. Also wanted to mention the Fremont Heritage Commission and Fremont County Historical Society has a booklet about the local cemeteries of Fremont County, and that is available for purchase at the museum and other places in town. And in our institution, as well as the Florence Pioneer Museum and the Florence Archives, has a more in-depth binder talking about tombstone symbols as well. So please check those out if you ever get a chance. It's mainly for the tombstones that are around in the local area, local Fremont County. We also want to invite all of you to join us again next month on Saturday, August 21st, for another virtual genealogy program with Terri. The topic in August will be genealogy books. The museum will be posting our online registration for that program in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, and welcome to another session sponsored by the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. This morning, we're going to talk about tombstones, a little bit of history, a little bit of symbolism, a little bit of meaning in each one of those symbols. And so let's just jump right in. The word tombstone is shorthand. It's a symbol for a simple object that represents a complex idea or an emotion. And we want to differentiate a tombstone versus a gravestone. A tombstone refers to a church grave, while a gravestone simply refers to a country grave or a grave that is not associated with a church or a church cemetery. While many people have individual tombstones, there are also family stones, and these are single stones that represent an entire family. While many of the names may not be recorded on a family stone, simply the family surname, you probably would need to visit either the cemetery office or find the cemetery records for who all is buried in that plot. A cenotaph is simply a marker in a cemetery, but the body is not present in that particular location. The body may have been lost at sea or may have died elsewhere, and they want the cenotaph to be with the family. A mausoleum is a freestanding building with interment spaces for either one deceased person or, in many cases, multiple family members. Columbarium is a building for housing of cremated remains. And this was a new term for me, a taphophile, a person who is interested in cemeteries, funerals, and gravestones. Here is an example of a family tombstone. It just simply has the name Jordan on it, and it may contain only one burial plot, or it may contain multiples. I know in my own family, we have one of these for my Cooney relatives, and there are 12 burial spots. or plots in the lot. But having to go to the cemetery office to find out who exactly is buried in that area. Here is an example of a cenotaph from Find a Grave. It's an old printout, and we see that it is a headstone that is placed along with the headstone for his daughter and his wife in Ohio. But Mr. Goddard actually died and was buried in Natchez, Mississippi. And it turns out that 1840 in Natchez, Mississippi was a famous tornado that killed hundreds of people. So that's why he's buried there. But his family wanted to remember him in their local area. Perhaps the most famous mausoleum for only one person, the Taj Mahal in India. Most of them are significantly smaller and contain multiple graves. Here is a wall that is a columbarium with many markers on the outside, but the ashes of our deceased loved ones are contained in the columbarium. It was interesting to me to find out that traditionally coffins were placed with the head to the west and the feet to the east. And this is so that on Judgment Day or with the resurrection, that we are ready to rise up to face the new day when the trumpets will sound and the dead shall be raised. This tradition is based on biblical text, and the belief that Christ will, at the time of resurrection, will come from the east. And so the dead will rise to meet and face him. Here again, traditionally, husbands are buried on the south side, the left of the plot, where their wives are buried on the north or right side. So if you find a tombstone for your family and it has the two separate entries for the husband and wife, see if the husband is on the left and the wife is on the right, to see if that tradition still exists today. When the colonies were first settled, the most important thing was to raise crops so that you could feed yourself through the winter. But during that short period of time, people also were dying, and they had to find places for them to be buried. In most cases, they chose the terrain that was not suitable for farming. In the New England colonies, there were many areas that were hilly and had rocky soil, so they were inappropriate for farming. And so that's where the traditional burial grounds were established. There are very few existing records for colonial burials. And if someone was fortunate enough to have an actual gravestone, those might still be in existence today. The lots were not sold as we see them today. The cemeteries were used and filled in the order in which they were needed. So you might find if the husband died first, he may be buried in one area of the cemetery. And if his wife died many years later, she might be in a completely separate area. Early on, there were no professional stone masons. So people used wooden markers or simple posts, maybe crosses, or they somehow carved a field stone and marked the grave that way. Here's an example from Jamestown, Virginia, one of the oldest settlements. The graves were probably originally marked with either just mounds of stone or mounds of dirt or simple wooden crosses, which then deteriorated. And we know 300 years later, 400 years later, we can ascertain exactly where burials have taken place. And these simple metal crosses have been inserted to mark those places. While these tombstones do not date from the 16 or 1700s, it is kind of a miracle that after more than 100 years, these wooden stones, or exactly markers, are still in existence today. And here is one, and I realize that it's very difficult even for me to read, but this is a simple field stone that tells us that Susanna has died. She was very young, but it dates from 1630. So this is one of those simple field stones that was carved. As we've said, many of the graves were unmarked or very, very simply marked in the early 1600s. But by the mid 1600s, with greater immigration from Europe to America, we are seeing the first influx of skilled stone workers. They used the material that was at hand. In New England, it was sandstone and slate because they were softer stones that could be quarried, cut, and carved. It wasn't until much later that marble tended to be used, and the tools were more appropriate for the harder stone. The primary style at the time was the tablet, and we will be taking a look at several of the shapes of tombstones. And up until 1750, 90% of gravestones displayed winged skulls. And we will also be taking a look at those and the symbolism that they represent. Here is a listing of some of the more common tombstone types, and we'll be going and looking at each one of these. Many of them are self-descriptive. They do take the shape of the actual, or they do have the actual shape that is described, and we'll look at those. The primary style early on and to this day is the tablet. It's a single piece of cut stone, and it is placed in an upright or standing position. The shapes, the imagery, and the symbolism, as the country expanded, these three items were adapted and varied by the individual regions. So you might see tablets that are different in the West as opposed to colonial New England or even in the Midwest. A little bit more decorative is a domed tombstone. And this can come up to either kind of a point or just a simple dome. And we also have what is called a shouldered tablet. It has the two shoulders around the dome. And you'll also notice that we do have the winged skull that we're going to talk about in a minute or two. A cradle grave is another form that is kind of self-explanatory. It has a headstone and a footstone, and it has curbs on either side. Some of the cradle graves may simply just be a curbed outline without the headstone and footstone. And the idea behind these was to have an area where flowers could be planted. You'll notice she's hard to see, but we do have an angel in the clouds, and she's representing the divine abode in heaven. A ledger stone is a simple, flat stone set into the ground, as opposed to the vertical stones. These are horizontal and laid flat. We have chest tombs that come to us from the Egyptian sarcophagus. Very, very similar, but not nearly as decorated. A simple chest with a lid that can be removed for the placement of the coffin. Table tombs, we have the tabletop with the supporting legs. And these were used early on in the early 17 and 1800s. And I guess depending on the number of pillars holding that tabletop in place, but they were deemed very fragile, and many of them did tip over or fall. So they were not used extensively beyond that time period. And now we get into some self-descriptive ones. This is a pillar tombstone, and we see quite a number of them in this particular cemetery, as well as the obelisk, which the four sides taper as it goes up. So it's a little bit different than the other. This type of tombstone is known as a gateway to heaven, and it represents the heavenly entrance, the passage from earth to heaven and to the afterlife. This one happens to be very, very large. Many of them are significantly smaller, probably less than half of this size, and they do actually have gates on them. And if the gate is open, it is the soul entering into heaven. And we'll be talking about some of the symbolism that we find on many of these. We've already talked about that winged skull, or commonly known also as the death head. Tombstones reflect the religion and culture at the time that the work was created and can have multiple meanings. While early tombstones originally reflected the prevailing styles of Europe, as our country developed, society and culture changed, and so did the art on the tombstone. Known as the death head, the winged skull was initially a non-religious symbol used to denote simply a buried corpse. Puritans did not believe in using religious symbols on graves. The skull symbolizes physical death, while wings symbolize the journey of the deceased is not over. They've shed their physical form and are flying to another realm, hopefully spiritual regeneration. And as I said earlier, it's estimated that up to 1750, about 90% of gravestones displayed these winged skulls. We have the wings. Look at the design on those wings. In this particular case, we see round eyes and we see teeth. We also see a little bit later on that the wings have changed form. The eyes have become more oval and almond-shaped, and the teeth have been replaced by a heart. At the same time, here again, we have round eyes, but the wings have been replaced by something that looks more like hair. This was known as a Medusa Tombstone, after the mythological character Medusa. The teeth and heart-shaped mouth have been replaced by a simple line. These designs are unique, and they do represent the stonemason's signature. You can date and tell who the tombstone artist was simply by some of the symbolism that is used in these early tombstones. We see a skull and crossbones in numerous of the old colonial cemeteries, and it's simply a reminder, a symbol of the memento mori, which means that death is going to come to us all, and it's going to be us, each one of us, at some point, some day in the future. As Puritanism began to decline, tombstones took on more of a childlike facial expression and a little bit more innocence. There was not as much terror as far as death was concerned. Here again, the eyes are almond-shaped. We do have the wings, but the face is not quite so foreboding. These show the strong belief in salvation and resurrection, and they do focus more on the immortal component of death rather than the fire and brimstone. Here again, the wings represent the flight of the soul from the body upward to heaven and the hope of resurrection. The urn and the willow. This is one of the predominant images used in the 18th and early 19th century gravestones. The willow is an ancient symbol of mourning, and the urn is a repository for the ashes of the dead in ancient times. The willow suggests this change in emphasis, this shift from the fate of the soul of the deceased, but instead to the mourning of those who were left behind. The urn dates back to Imperial Roman times, where it held the ashes of the deceased. And instead of fearing their loved one's damnation, the depiction is now much more peaceful. The emblems of death have shifted as the interpretation of society, the interpretation of life. Life is not as fearful as it once was, and we have changed from terror to peace. The draped urn. After the cross, this was one of the most popular symbols used. And here again, it represents immortality, a positive symbol. The drape is a veil, the separation between life and death, and it guards the contents of the urn. Torches. We have a lit torch, and it's going to be the guiding light to the everlasting life. And the flame itself can also be symbolic of the soul. When it is facing downwards, it refers to a life that has been extinguished. When it faces upwards, it represents life and perhaps eternal life. The torch illuminates the darkness and therefore means enlightenment, and it can also symbolize zeal, liberty, or immortality. The roses that are also appear on here represent eternal love, youth, hope, or perhaps sadness at the loss of our loved one. We see many children, statues of children in cemeteries, and we also see sleeping children. And these are usually graves of babies or young children. And these date from Victorian times. The idea that they are draped in either a blanket or have few clothes shows their innocence, that they had nothing to hide. A broken column is simply a life cut short. It may be a memorial to someone before they reached old age, or even before they reached the age of majority, typically around 21. The ivy and vines. Ivy is one of those evergreen things, so it may represent the immortality, and the vines that come back every spring represent the fidelity, friendship, and rebirth, much as the vines do in actual life. A universal symbol, the dove, not only on tombstones, but in other areas of our life. The dove is a symbol of peace. On tombstones, here again, it represents innocence and the possibility for resurrection. When the dove is in an ascending form, it represents the soul rising to heaven. If he were in a descending form, it connotes safe passage. The olive branch, just like today, representing peace, it means that the soul has reached a sense of peace. Clasped hands. This could mean a mason by profession, but in many cases it represents a married couple. And there are things to pay attention to on this. Look at the cuffs. The more straightforward usually represents the male, whereas the cuff that is a little more decorative represents the female. And look at the position of the hands. The hand that is on top, in this case, the husband's, indicates that he was the one that passed away first. And he is going to guide his wife to the afterlife when her time comes. So pay attention to the cuffs, which one is the male, which one is the female, and look at the hands to see who passed away first. Forefingers. The forefinger pointing up indicates the hope of heaven. Hands represent relationships with other people as well as with God, and they may be in many, many different forms. When we see the finger pointing down, it represents God reaching down for the soul. There also may be hands holding a Bible, which connotes faith and hope in immortality, praying hands, honoring God. There are many, many hand symbols and hand positions to look at in the cemeteries. The oak branch is a symbol of strength and endurance, and the acorn may mean that they lived a long life or perhaps endured a long illness. The wreath, like the wedding band, it is a complete circle, and it connotes eternal life and the victory over death. The position of the head looking down is a reflection of thought and sorrow. And in this particular case, it's very hard to see, but she is holding a stem in her hand, but the bloom is missing. So here again, a life cut short. The Celtic Cross might denote one's heritage. The Celtic Cross is associated with the Irish and those with Irish heritage. In this particular case, the family, it was originally O'Neill, but it has been Americanized and shortened to Neil, but they were originally from Ireland. The circle again represents infinity, and the four arms of the cross denote self, nature, wisdom, and the divine. The open book is a Bible, which presents perfect knowledge. If it were a closed book, it might mean that the life completed, or it could also mean a school teacher. We have a wreath, once again, for immortality, and we have the palm fronds for our victory over death. On this particular statue, the mother is looking up towards her heavenly reward, and the daughter is looking down, leaving her earthly life behind. There are many other symbols that might be used in the cemeteries, and some of them can differentiate various religions. They can give you clues to the country of origin, and they might also denote fraternal organizations or societies or other memberships that your ancestor might have that in your genealogical research you might want to delve into further. We see the hand holding the heart, and this is a symbol of charity. It was used by various organizations. One was the Shakers, which is a religious order that promoted the simple life of hard work and spirituality. Their motto was, "Put your hands to work and your love to God." It's also used by the Independent Order of Oddfellows. And in addition, the Oddfellows added these 3 linked rings for friendship, love, and truth. The letter G is the basis of Freemasonry's origins. Uniting the concept of God with geometry is a way of connecting the spiritual world to the physical world. So our G represents both God, the grand architect of the universe, as well as geometry, and we are connecting the two. This has gone awfully fast. There are many tombstones today, and most of them are of the tablet form, and they do still have some of these older symbols, but many of them have adopted symbols that are more meaningful to the individuals who are buried in their individual plots. So we're going to take a look at a couple of humorous ones to see what they tell us about those folks. Here is one. It is from New England, and the gentleman in this particular case owned a clothespin factory. And when clothespins of this type went out of fashion or went to plastic, he continued his factory and made lead pencils. So it tells part of the story of his life. That's why it's got the clothespin. This particular tombstone with a biplane with a propeller. I'm not exactly sure. I cannot read this particular label. I would assume that it represents either World War I or early part of World War II, where this might have been a young person that was killed in a training accident, or perhaps during World War I as a pilot. Hugo, Oklahoma is famous. Their cemetery is famous as a circus burial ground. So that we see a big top in the back with more elephants, and this one happens to be an elephant act. Barbara and William are still alive. Here are their birth dates, and they celebrate Anna May, who is their elephant. I don't think the elephant is actually buried in this cemetery. And here's one from Fremont County, Colorado. And we know what this gentleman did for a living. And it tells a significant part of his life story, as well as the fact that he was a veteran. So we have some more modern descriptions, but we notice that many of the tombstones are of a variation of the tablet form nowadays. Hopefully you have received a copy of the handout that I provided. It will also be, I believe, in the chat box so that you can download it. And it gives a quite complete listing in alphabetical order of all of the symbols that you might encounter on various tombstones. So I apologize that I could have done a lot more symbols this morning, but we've gone through very, very quickly. And at this point, I guess I'll open it up for any questions that you might have.
Well, Terri, apparently you've done such a good job. There's no questions today. You know, it really does bring to mind that these tombstones from hundreds of years ago had a lot of symbolism to tell a story, maybe a story that we don't in the past have not understood to interpret. And your presentation has gone a long ways to help us to read more about the person or their life or death. And the more contemporary ones that you gave as example is a challenge to each one of us to what type of legacy do we want to tell future generations about maybe our occupation, like the truck driver, or interest, what someone did in the military. We've seen bombers and all sorts of symbols of race cars and things that are much more contemporary, but it tells a little bit more about the person. Likewise, we've seen many of them that have the portraits or photos that have been embedded as a medallion. And I think being able to leave a legacy is important in tombstones, not only what the name of the person was, but the dates involved, but about their character and about their lives. So this has been very informative. Thank you very much. There are no questions.
So, well, thank you too, Dan, and thank you to those of you that are watching this morning. I hope that between this and the handout, that perhaps when thinking about your own tombstone, as Dan mentioned, what do you want to be remembered for? And do you want classic symbols that date from hundreds of years ago? Or do you want contemporary symbols that tell a story about your life and that your loved ones in future years can come and visit? So before we close, as Lisa mentioned, I do want to advertise Saturday, August 21st, we're going to be talking about books and genealogy. We tend to turn to the internet for so much of our genealogy sources, but there are very many books that will give us additional information and will help us to look elsewhere into where to find records as well as the individual records themselves. And as a final reminder, we do want to once again echo the work done by the Fremont County Historical Society in publishing their cemetery booklets, which are available at the various museums and history centers in the local area. So with that, we'll close this morning and thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in August. Thank you again. Have a good day.